This video was brought to you by Imprint. Renting in the UK is a miserable affair. It's ridiculously expensive, the properties are often in dire need of repair, and it can feel like landlords have apparently unlimited power. The Tories have been promising to sort this out since Theresa May all the way back in 2019, but their renters reform bill was endlessly delayed and was eventually ditched just before the election. Fortunately for any renters out there, earlier this month Labour introduced their own renters' rights bill, promising to ameliorate the rental crisis by banning no-fault evictions, introducing a new decent home standard for rental properties, and a whole load of measures to reduce the rapid increase in rents we've seen since the pandemic. So in this video, we're going to take yet another look at the UK's rental crisis, Labour's new renters' rights bill, and whether it will actually work. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start by explaining the crisis in the UK's private rental sector. Renting in the UK has always been pretty suboptimal, both because there aren't that many protections for renters, and because, unlike in some other countries where renting is a popular, flexible form of permanent residence, the vast majority of renters are essentially just waiting until they have enough of their own money to buy their own property, and thereby benefit from the apparently never-ending rise in UK property prices. However, things have become especially bad in the past few years. According to honest data, private rents are up nearly 10% year on year, and this rate of increase has been rising steadily since early 2022. This is historically unprecedented, and means that rents have risen by something like 30% in the past few years, with an even steeper increase in places like London. So what's going on here? Well, some of this is to do with rising interest rates. Obviously, in theory, rising interest rates are supposed to reduce the amount of credit or money in the overall economy, and in doing so, bring down prices. But recent experience suggests that they've had the reverse effect on rents, which have increased massively. This is both because high interest rates discourage would-be first-time buyers who might choose to rent instead of taking out a high-interest mortgage, and also because landlords often just pass on the increased costs of their mortgages to their tenants. This is one of the ways that interest rate hikes have distributional consequences. In theory, rising interest rates are just supposed to take money out of the economy, but in practice, they have a disproportionate impact on poorer and younger people. COVID didn't help much either. During the pandemic, the rental market cooled down significantly because, well, no one was moving out. The stamp duty holiday that the government introduced to prop up the housing market during the pandemic also encouraged lots of landlords to just sell their properties, encouraging some 140,000 landlords to retire over the pandemic, which means less supply and therefore higher prices. But the main reason is that despite rising interest rates, house prices have continued to go up. Across the UK, the average amount of time required to save for a deposit is now about 9 years, rising to more like 15 in London and other desirable cities. This has forced more and more people, especially young people who make up about 80% of the market, into the private rental sector, pushing up prices even further. Now, this crisis became so acute that even the Tories tried to fix it, introducing the Renters' Reform Bill way back in 2019, before quietly shelving it earlier this year. Now, Labour accused the Tories of caving to vested interests and promised an overhaul of the sector in their manifesto. And, well, early this month, we found out what this overhaul would include when the new government introduced their Renters' Rights Bill to Parliament. As we see it, the bill plans to do 5 main things. Firstly, it will abolish Section 21 evictions, often called no-fault evictions. These are when landlords kick out tenants without reason, and they become increasingly common over the past few years as prices have risen. Second, Labour promised to increase the quality of rental properties by introducing a new decent home standard, enforcing higher energy efficiency standards, and extending Awaab's law to the private rental sector, which would require landlords to address serious hazards such as damp and mould. And this is a good idea. A 2011 study found that something like 35% of all privately rented properties fall below the UK's current non-binding decent home standard, with safety hazards in 21% of properties and 15% of properties lacking minimal heat in winter, with a similar fraction falling into the lowest energy efficiency bands. Thirdly, it will create a new private rented sector database to provide landlords with better information about their new obligations and allow potential tenants to check their landlord's compliance records. We'll have to see exactly what this ends up looking like, but it could be a really good policy. Local authorities insist that the vast majority of problems in the private rental sector are caused by a handful of serially bad landlords, and letting tenants know ahead of time if their potential landlord is a good or a bad one could squeeze them out of the market. Fourthly, it will scrap fixed-term tenancies, allowing any tenant to get out of any tenancy agreement with 2 months' notice. Now, without a fixed-term contract, you might worry that landlords would just be able to raise rents every couple of months. But this brings us nicely onto the fifth thing on our list, a whole load of measures that will attempt to bring down prices. The bill would make it literally illegal for landlords to accept prices above the advertised rent, and will only be able to increase rents once a year, and only to the so-called market rate, which the supplementary notes to the bill define as the price that would be achieved if the property were newly advertised to let. If a tenant believes that the proposed rent exceeds market rate, then they can challenge this at a tribunal. So, will these reforms actually work? Well, while these reforms might look sensible in the long term, in the short term they do risk exacerbating the crisis. Landlords will now need to spend more time and money upgrading their properties, which could mean fewer properties on the market and yet higher rents. Landlords might also demand higher rents to accommodate for the risk of a tenant leaving abruptly or refusing eviction, or to make sure that they don't have to raise prices later and risk a tribunal. In short, unless it's implemented cleverly, market logic would suggest higher prices in the short term. Ultimately, it's worth remembering that the rental crisis is in many ways a symptom of a wider housing crisis, and lower house prices, or more homes, is probably the only complete solution to this problem. Fans of TLDR, like you, care about understanding the world around them, and that's where today's sponsor Imprint comes into play. Because if you care about building a life of learning, then Imprint is the app for you. It's a brand new way to learn, built from the ground up. And seriously, unless you've used the app before, you likely haven't experienced anything like this. That's because Imprint is beautifully illustrated and animated, creating a highly visual, bite-sized, and interactive learning experience. It's the perfect antidote to a world where social media tries to keep us mindlessly dopamine scrolling day in, day out. Their library includes courses on topics like psychology, history, philosophy, finance, productivity, and many more, as well as quick reads you can consume in a single sitting. In fact, I've been using the Essential Philosophy, Theories and Thinkers course, and it's been an excellent way to brush up on some knowledge from college that I genuinely thought was lost. And with all of the developments happening these days, from elections to AI to geopolitical tensions, it's been helpful to revisit some of the world's greatest thinkers. So make yourself feel better about your screen time, build a real habit of learning every day, and join the millions of people using Imprint. If you use the link in the description, the first 200 people will get 20% off an annual plan. Plus, they'll know you came from us.